Hallo, liebe Hörerinnen und Hörer von Stay Forever. Unsere Staffel von Stay Forever spielt zum Spiel Titanic Adventure Out of Time ist schon eine Weile her. Wir hatten uns damals bei mehreren der Beteiligten über Wochen hinweg um ein Abschlussinterview bemüht, aber ohne Erfolg. Die Staffel ging ohne Interview zu Ende. Und einen Monat später meldete sich dann überraschend doch noch Andrew Nelson bei uns, der Autor von Titanic, und sagte uns ein Interview zu, also reichen wir das nun nach. In der Folge hört ihr mein etwa einstündiges Gespräch mit Andrew auf Englisch. Wie gewohnt gibt es im Anschluss eine deutschsprachige Zusammenfassung. Wer diesen Podcast auf einem Podcatcher hört, kann über die Kapitelmarken direkt dorthin springen. Und nun viel Spaß mit dem Gespräch mit Andrew Nelson über Titanic Adventure Out of Time. Hello and welcome to this epilogue to our series of podcasts on Titanic Adventure Out of Time. I am very happy to speak with one of the creators of the game, Andrew Nelson. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, Christian. It's good to be here and to share with you some of my memories about creating Titanic Adventure Out of Time.
It's my pleasure. You are a journalist by trade and education. You have a master's degree in journalism and communication from the University of Missouri, Columbia. And in the early 90s, you worked as an editor for a couple of years prior to your time at Cyberflix. And you have since built a career as a journalist and a travel writer, in particular for National Geographic, among others. And you're also teaching communication and writing on a college and university level. Is that summary reasonably accurate?
That summary is very accurate. I worked for National Geographic Traveler for a long, long time.
Where were you in the early 90s and how did you get involved with Cyberflix?
This was the early 1990s, and I had been a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which was an elite journalism school in the United States, one of 3 or 4, and was working for a company called Whittle Communications, which was trying to pioneer different methods of delivering magazines to readers. And I was intrigued with their entrepreneurial spirit, so came on board there and found myself living in the Smoky Mountains. Surprise to me, who had previously lived in New York and Los Angeles. But what was going on was at that time, there was a lot of experimentation and a lot of things that were happening, both in media and, of course, with technology. And thanks to digitization and the internet, these strands were all converging. And we were lucky enough to found a computer gaming company called Cyberflix. The company was founded by Bill Appleton and Jamie Wicks, who had gotten together. Jamie was a computer artist. And they got together to create a game called Lunicus. Bill had been working in Silicon Valley and had been working heavily with the Macintosh and designing software programming for the Mac. At that point, he had created something called Supercard, and he was sort of renowned as a genius out in Silicon Valley, but he really missed the mountains of East Tennessee and decided that he would return and then found this company. Now, people were always very surprised that something like this could flourish in Tennessee, which has a reputation for Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, and maybe hillbillies. But everybody tends to forget that there was a lot of technology. The Manhattan Project, which was the creation of the atomic bomb, began in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, about 20 miles to the east of Knoxville, which is where the University of Tennessee is. And it remained a very big high-tech government-funded center, as was the University of Tennessee. So there was, and still is, a huge amount of technological expertise in that community. So Bill's father and I think mother worked at Oak Ridge. So comes from a scientific family, and he was responsible for creating these tools that were called the Dream Factory, which was a suite of software tools that would help create these environments. So he started this company and called it, I wanted to say it was CyberSoft. And we switched the name. Friends of mine knew Bill, and that's how I got to meet Bill. I quickly became incredibly intrigued with this idea of what he was doing, because I thought this was the new thing. Scott Scheinbaum, who did sound, and Jamie and myself and Bill became the nucleus for Cyberflix. Later, Eric Quist, Bill's friend from Oak Ridge, signed on, and then Rand Cabus as well. So there were about 6 sort of founding partners. Dina Causius worked with Rand. She did our PR. So that was basically the nucleus for the company that became Cyberflix, and then created these titles, of which Titanic was our biggest hit.
Obviously, Titanic Adventure Out of Time is the game that we are going to talk about primarily today. And on that game, you are credited simply as writer. First of all, I'd like to get a clearer understanding of what that meant. What was your role on the project?
Well, my role was writer, producer, and I would say cheerleader, because it was my idea to do the Titanic. Actually, it was my sister-in-law's idea, because I had been visiting her in suburban New York City, and my brother, and she had 2 young children at the time, and she had said, well, these CD-ROM games seem very interesting. She had seen Myst, and she goes, I just don't have time with 2 young children to play these games for hours. She goes, it sure would be nice if you could create a game with lots of characters that would end in 2 hours like a movie. I said yes. Well, we had been very interested in expanding the market for adventure games and knew that women weren't very involved in gaming at that point. So on the way back to Knoxville on the plane, I remember there was an article that mentioned the time it took for the Titanic to sink after hitting the iceberg. And it was about 2.5 hours. And I went, what would it be like to create a game that you would have as much gameplay as you wanted in the first part until you gathered a certain series of items that would then trigger the striking of the iceberg, but then you only had 2.5 hours, as long as it took for the actual survivors of the Titanic to do what you had to do, wrap it up and get out on a lifeboat. And so that's basically how that came to the fore. It allowed us to think in larger ways about digital worlds and environments. They needed to be contained, of course, because they could not be infinite, given the size and the capacity of hard drives at the time. So something like the Titanic proved to be very useful because it was a universe and a world, yet it was contained. It was on one ship or in one set. So it was a very interesting time. And I would like to use the German word Zeitgeist to talk about what was actually going on in 1995, because it was a very curious thing that there were so many aspects of the Titanic that were surfacing at the time in popular culture, in high culture. People were thinking and talking about Titanic. So we weren't the only ones. We just picked up on it. And I think that the reason was, and this is my own pet theory, is that the Titanic seems to surface in our popular culture whenever the lesson of technological hubris seems to come to the fore, to remind us that our technology is not so great in the hands of an angry ocean, an angry God, what have you. So, of course, again, the internet and digital technology was exploding in the early 90s. So this seemed an obvious way to press and create and load this game on a CD-ROM and to share it with the world.
So to reiterate, you came up with the idea of the game, you wrote the game, you produced the game. What did producing entail?
Producer really meant creating, driving, and making the team understand what this was all about and how we would be the first people ever to build the Titanic in digital dry dock. So it was an amazing effort, and it was a huge effort. I think I was in that office every single day for an entire year, no vacation.
Did you also design the puzzles?
Bill designed the puzzles. That was more of a collective group effort because, of course, no one person could do it. And, I had the sense for character, setting, storyline, narrative. And so Bill and a team of the programmers would come up with the puzzles. And everybody in the company contributed to it. But Cyberflix at that time was mostly, I think the average age was like 22. All of us were living and working in a 2-story loft in the Central Market Square of Knoxville, Tennessee. So It was quite funny because the rest of the community didn't quite know about us until there was a fire alarm and a fire had started on the roof. And all of a sudden, the rest of Knoxville, all of these bankers and lawyers saw all these guys in, at that point, Doc Martens carrying out hard drives, because that's what all we were doing. It's like, oh my God, the hard drive, save them. I remember the secretary was grabbing hard drive. Everybody was grabbing hard drives to get. And then they saw all these, basically, to their eyes, kids come running out of this building and became very intrigued with what we were doing there.
Was the company from the beginning intended to be a company that would be creating products for CD-ROM and with Macintosh as the lead platform?
Let's put it this way. Apple was our heart and soul, and PCs were the wallet. Bill was a completely devoted Apple fan. We all were, but recognizing that the majority of people played on PCs at that point, that was a business decision, of course. You had to do both platforms, but we're totally Mac-centric. Because of the graphics, all of the guys, our digital artists, had Macs as well.
And CD-ROM?
Well, CD-ROM was because it was a vehicle that could contain the most data to be able to deliver what we were trying to do. That was the way these games were created back then. It's kind of hard to think about it then, but that's why. You've got to remember that the pipes in the internet were incredibly small at the time. So the best way to get your data was to press it on a CD-ROM.
Right. So our listeners may not be familiar with the first two games from Cyberflix, which would be Lunicus and Jump Raven. And I'll briefly describe them as shooter games in a 3D environment, albeit with restricted movement. So players could only turn in 90-degree angles and move block by block, like in role-playing games such as Dungeon Master or Eye of the Beholder. Were you already involved in the creation of these games?
I came aboard as Lunicus was shipping. I wrote the storyline for Jump Raven, and then the game between Jump Raven and Titanic was Dust, A Tale of the Wired West. That was the adventure game. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, so that preceded Titanic, and in a way, that became the stepping stone for what would become Titanic.
For Lunicus and Jump Raven, do you happen to know whether they were successful?
They were, although not as successful as Titanic. I would not know the sales figures for either. I did go to Japan and accept an award from Apple Japan for Jump Raven at the time, but they were both successful, though none of them were as successful as Titanic.
Okay. So I primarily mentioned Lunicus and Jump Raven because they were very different games from Dust or Titanic. So you already mentioned Dust, A Tale of the Wild West, which came out in 1995, I think. And that game was a stark departure from Lunicus and Jump Raven. You entered a new genre, the adventure game. The game looked differently. Now it was digitized actors as opposed to the drawn graphics that the earlier games had. My question would be, why this shift? In particular, why the shift to adventure games?
Well, Myst was such a seminal game. It's hard to recall the impact that game had on people visually. It would literally send shivers up your spine when you realized that you could create games that weren't just shooters, but actually had art, character, occupied time and space, and could move you emotionally. And the combination of adding layers of sound and music to it created an atmospheric experience that was quite immersive for the time. So again, in our idea where we were very conscious, we wanted to create Myst, but something perhaps less esoteric and something as a universal appeal, for example, as a Western might have. So hence we did, which was Bill's idea to do Dust. So it was all very good fun to create that, but that did serve as the step to Titanic, which was the next rung from that.
Cyberflix and Dust, how was that funded?
We were getting advances from several distributors who would give us advances to create the games. I was one of the creatives, so as far as I was concerned, I had a paycheck every week. And we had fun for parties. Oh my gosh. The parties that Cyberflix put on fast became notorious in Knoxville.
How so?
Oh, well, if you could imagine, out of nowhere, you have all of these young guys with a lot of development money. And, of course, some of that went to team building exercises like the Wynona-Rider-with-Fangs party. There are still people in Knoxville who remember the Wynona-Rider-with-Fangs party. It went down as one of the great parties in East Tennessee in the 1990s, I can tell you that. I think it went all night in our loft. So it was around Halloween, I believe. And Wynona-Rider was on the invitation with fangs. And that's all I remember.
But she did not attend the party, did she?
No, she did not attend the party.
That would have been awesome.
I know. We had Laurie Anderson come. Laurie Anderson, the famous New York experimental sound artist. And we really followed her motto, virtual reality will never be real until they can figure out how to put the dirt in it. I remember we really liked that saying because we really thought you have that uncanny valley of digital sets where everything is so perfect and mathematically generated, and yet there's no litter. There's no trash. And what we wanted to do is to create the unexpected. And I remember Bill was able, one night, he spent the entire night programming chickens to appear on the streets of the western town in dust randomly and would move on their own volition. Independently of your action, they would just appear. And we thought that was just the most amazing thing. That would later come in handy with having characters show up, for example, in Titanic. So it was a very exciting time to work in that field then because we really knew that we were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. I mean, I think we were all very conscious of that, but it was just fun to do. It still was the most fun job I've ever had.
I asked about the funding because I'm trying to understand how much creative freedom you had with a game like Dust or later Titanic. Because typically, if you accept advances from a publisher, the publisher would also want to have a say in the creation of the game.
Correct. But you have to remember this was so new, the publishers had no idea. They just knew the kids loved this. The kids were all over it. We could make a lot of money out of it. I remember once Rand and I took a meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles. And a friend of mine's friend, she was a woman who was involved in film production. And she said, all right, let's see what you got. So we're all sort of used to, we showed her this. She goes, I don't know what it is, but you're going to make a lot of money off of it. At that time, we were getting checks to create a couple of things. We were getting checks to create or help produce branded entertainment. I remember we got some money from Japan to create a series of animated figures, but Bill was a very smart guy. He said, okay, we're going to take this and use some of that money to fund our own titles, and we could have some independence. So it was a combination, I think, of larger firms, larger entertainment corporations, not knowing what was possible, knowing that they had to fund some of this and maybe strike it rich, and then also doing some of those other production contracts for some of those Hollywood studios.
So Cyberflix was doing work for hire at the side?
That's a good way to put it. We were taking the money we were making and plowing it back into creating our own titles.
So you mentioned that Dust was a stepping stone for Titanic. If you look at Dust, what would you say in hindsight, what worked well in that game and what didn't?
That's a good question. I think the technology worked really, really well. I need to give a shout out to Bill Appleton and his amazing technology Dream Factory that actually allowed us to create these characters and have them talk on the fly. So basically, you could program their mouths to move and get reactions from their faces based on the scripting, as well as creating entire worlds with programmable elements that would act independently of game action. So it was really Bill's technology that made this all come to life. But I think the characters in Dust really didn't have as much of a personality arc as that would happen in Titanic. Of course, the Titanic is always a great place to set a story because it's such life or death circumstances. But, all in all, when I think about the world that was created with Dust, it's hard to look at it without thinking that everything we were doing was a giant experiment. How would this work? How do you create an entire town? We fast understood that there was an limitless amount of data you seemingly could put in, numerous storylines that would take hours to follow. So how do you sort of funnel that? I think we learned to funnel players into gameplay. We're more facile at it by the time we got to Titanic. For example, I had people who would tell me that they loved Dust because they just like to sit and look at the sky and see the shooting stars that we programmed in. So people would always have these strange reactions to all of these games, these adventure games. Of course, the bulk of the players were all about the gameplay, but you would get some people who just would leave the game on. For example, the Titanic with Scott Sheinbaum's wonderful soundtrack because they liked it. So it was an interesting reaction. But again, you have to remember, nobody had seen things like this. Now we have so much CGI in our lives, it's sort of hard to forget just how novel this seemed.
Yes, people were making their first experiences in worlds like these. And if your first experience of a rendered 3D world with interactive characters was Dust, then it's going to be a very impressive experience.
Correct. And again, let's not forget that the resolution on the average color television set in 1995 was nowhere near what it was with a computer monitor. So when you looked at it, it was like looking at jewels. We all have high def wherever we go, but you have to remember, and especially in America, because Americans always would go to Europe in the 90s and before in the 80s and come back and, oh my God, their television sets are like Blade Runner, because you guys had a higher definition ratio than Americans did. So, but again, having computer monitors with that degree of resolution, a quantum leap above that, people just were dazzled.
You must have learned some lessons from Dust that informed the design of Titanic. So superficially, the games are relatively similar in look and feel and in gameplay. What would you say is the biggest difference between Dust and Titanic?
I think Titanic had a more sophisticated relationship with the player. I think it was more character-driven, if that's possible to say. I think because of the time element in the second part of the game, it created a pacing and a tension that just didn't exist in Dust. You could take your pace, it could be leisurely. Titanic, you get into this world and may have taken a long time, but once you assembled the key elements that triggered the ship striking the iceberg, then it was totally playing for time. I mean, we would get comment after comment like, I love this game, but oh my God, I can't get there. I always die in the end. So I think that was part of it. The rhythm was distinctly different.
So yeah, we're now approaching Titanic, Adventure Out of Time, finally. It's a big topic. But before I go there, one more thing, because you already mentioned zeitgeist, as you so nicely put it, that the Titanic was in the zeitgeist in the mid-90s, but also Myst-like CD-ROM adventure games, interactive movies were in the zeitgeist in the gaming industry. And you were basically at the crossroads of these things. I'm trying to understand how aware you were of the fact that, for instance, the movie was in production, or the fact that other game companies out there were working on Myst-like games.
Well, we were aware that other companies were working with Myst-like games, but when we started this, we had no idea that there was somebody working on a Broadway musical about the Titanic. There was somebody named James Cameron that was working on a film about the Titanic. I think we first heard about that while we had started production, and we rushed out a press release because we were naturally worried that they would come out with a competing title, a computerized CD-ROM. Because at that point, a lot of the adventure movies were coming out with these CD-ROMs with sort of insipid gameplay. They were really pretty bad, but they didn't really care. It was just to soak up revenue. So we were well underway before we heard about the Cameron movie. But again, the zeitgeist of the time, there were so many other things. There was a woman who won the Booker Prize in the UK, a woman author who came out with a novel set on the Titanic. All of this was happening in the mid-90s. It was really an interesting time.
There's another interesting coincidence, because at the same time that you worked on Titanic, Jordan Mechner, the creator of Prince of Persia, worked on a game called The Last Express, which has a strikingly similar premise in that it tried to use the new technology of 3D rendered graphics and CD-ROM storage to faithfully recreate, in this case, the Orient Express, and then use it as a stage for a mystery adventure game. Were you aware of that project?
We heard about it, and Jordan and I actually spoke at E3. It was wonderful. I loved their idea, and I loved their premise. I think we were always aware that creating periods of history were very difficult for the traditional gamer. They may have been computer nerds, but they weren't history nerds. And the idea of adventure, dealing with historical time periods, was probably not going to be an easy sell. I mean, I remember talking to the artists like, oh man, 1912, boring. It's all black and white. And I remember saying, I said, no, you got to remember, this is like a spaceship. Don't think of it as history. Think of it as a starship. How people dress and how they talk, those are the rules. And then have fun with it any other way. And of course, we had all of the blueprints. Those are extant. You can find them. So the guys would just have the blueprints and they would figure out how to create these rooms with the exact dimensions. It was quite funny because they became authorities on the interior decoration of Edwardian England, going, no, I don't think that wallpaper would be that color. It would be this. On breaks, they'd be blasting aliens. But then they go back and go, well, wait a minute. Did the furniture look like this or it look like that? But they took great pride in the historical accuracy of that layout that they built, that set that they built.
See, and that's endlessly fascinating for me because I wonder why. I mean, obviously the Titanic existed. As you mentioned, there are blueprints, there are photographs. So you have to accommodate for some people having an idea of what the Titanic would have looked like. But if you approach this from the point of view of a game, the question of whether the furniture is accurate or the wallpapers are period accurate is actually pretty unimportant. So why put this focus on historic accuracy?
I think because we were the first. I would always tell them, you are the first people to do anything like this ever. And I think it was really important for them to have an understanding of what we were doing, not just on creating a game, but again, I was very aware of the moment. At that point, I had gone and I had gotten out books and had read stories of the conversion from silent film to talking film in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the waves of technology that washed over Hollywood, especially during the silent era. That was probably analogous to that time for computer games. But we were aware of that.
You did it because you could.
Yes, of course. I mean, I still remember we would get international students. Tennessee had a relatively good technology-focused graduate program in business. And we would get those students coming through, these master students and graduate students. And invariably, both the Asian and the European students would say, how did you start this? And we just said with our credit cards, because literally, I remember we were at Bill's house in the basement. This was the typical startup. And we needed money, and we all got cash advances on our credit cards to do it. And to those students who weren't American at the time, that just seemed totally insane. Because remember, that was sort of the entrepreneurial spirit. It still exists. Certainly other countries have caught up, but it still seems so daring to do that for a lot of people around the world. And I just want to let your listeners know we were not typical Americans in that we were always internationally focused, and we understood we needed international markets and that we had an international ear. So Bill had strong connections with the Japanese computer gaming community, and we had strong connections and lots of friends in Britain, and always knew that the European market was very important to us.
I'd like to delve a little bit on this point of historical accuracy because that's really important to me. I spoke with Jordan Mechner about The Last Express, and for him, recreating the Orient Express as realistically as possible that was actually based on the realization that the Orient Express from that time period, from 1914, was being lost to history because the cars had been destroyed and there was no real life recreation of that train. And so he basically decided, okay, we're going to do that virtually. We are going to recreate the train like it was, and that's going to be in the future most likely the only way to experience that particular train. So I'm wondering whether there was a similar approach or reasoning for you when you recreated the Titanic.
Absolutely. I think what was interesting to us because of the 3D environments and the way we built them was up to that time, you may have been able to create perhaps stage sets of the Titanic, but to be able to walk through the breadth and depth of the ship wasn't possible. So by doing what we did, now obviously we had our own limitations, but it was possible for the first time to wander from A deck to B deck to C deck, realize where the lifeboats were. Titanic historians actually thanked us for that because they could visualize sort of the problem. There was a big problem. Some of these lifeboats went off with maybe only 12 or 20 people in them when they could have taken 80. And it was never understood at the time why that happened. But you play the game and you realize if you're at lifeboat A, but everybody else is over by lifeboat E, they can't really see because of the size of the ship that you're ready to go. And even more so if you're on the other side, if you're on the aft side or what have you. But allowed people to visualize historical objects or events for the first time in 3D. That was one of the things that I think a lot of people responded to. So when Jordan was totally devoted to recreating the Orient Express, and he did just an amazing job. I remember being so jealous of his maps. He had such beautiful maps that he used. When the movie Titanic came out, I was in San Francisco. I'd relocated to San Francisco. I got up, called in sick. I went and I watched that movie 3 times. That's a long movie.
Wow.
Yeah. But what was so great was to watch somebody else's version of that and to not have to worry about all of the painstaking details. But I knew exactly where they were at any given time. And James Cameron had that same bug that we all did. He wanted to recreate it as accurately as he could. And I think he did a great job.
In a sense, any artistic recreation of a ship like the Titanic is an interpretation of that ship. And in your case, in the case of your game, you're also only showing parts of the Titanic. It's not that the entire ship is accessible or recreated in the game, it's parts of it.
We only had enough time and enough of a budget to do the parts that we did. We loved the hold and the furnaces just because they were great to render and draw. The first class staterooms were interesting. The captain's station was interesting. And the gym, we loved the gym. The gym was so much fun. So I think you just end up having to only showcase what you can. A little story, Paul Haskins, who was one of our 3D artists, they all came to us from the University of Tennessee. And how they would get hired is one would get hired and then he'd say, hey, my friend, can he just sit and help paint the backgrounds? And we'd like, yeah, sure. And then sooner or later, we'd kind of go, Alan's friend, Paul, yeah, why don't we hire him? So that's how these guys would get hired. So they'd just show up and they'd find us. But Paul's family came from Northern Ireland, from Belfast. And his grandfather worked at Harland and Wolff shipyards, the shipyards that built the Titanic. And 60 years later, in the 1990s, he was building those ships on a computer. The Titanic has the reputation of being the most beautiful ship ever built. And I think if you talk to aficionados and experts of the transatlantic steamers, a lot of them will sort of whisper to you, well, the Titanic really wasn't the nicest ship afloat. It was always the Germans had much better ships. So I would get a few of those from Titanic historians. But Titanic has that because of the tragedy, of course. It was its technology and it had the most beautiful people on it, all of these things. And in reality, I think one of the other things that we do tend to forget, it was the first real-time disaster. And what I mean by that is they had a wireless on board, one of the first ships to have a wireless. So they were able to broadcast their own demise to the rest of the world in real time. Here, people had news of a disaster as it was happening. So it was one of the first mass media events in the world. That's another first that people tend to forget about the Titanic.
All of the things which are informed by history are extremely fascinating to me for the interpretation of the game, because at the core, Titanic Adventure Out of Time is still a game. And this quest for historical accuracy, there's an interplay between that and gameplay. So again, to come back to The Last Express as an example, that's a train, and a train is a pretty confined space. So players of the game will find that orientation is difficult to them because everything is so tiny. That makes it difficult to navigate the train. It's kind of the opposite with Titanic. Everything is sprawling and you have these uniform large corridors. So movement in Titanic is something that takes a lot of time to get from A to B. And I guess that's also one of the reasons why you implemented the in-game map, where you can simply teleport from point A to point B.
Yeah. We quickly realized we were going to have to do something like that because of the time it took to navigate the physical ship. It was one of the adaptations that we made to increase gameplay. Because again, as you point out, ultimately this is a game. It gets pretty boring if you're walking from A deck to B deck to C deck and all that in between. So you really needed to be able to leapfrog ahead, as it were.
So that particular issue is easily remedied with that in-game map. There's other things where we wondered whether the Titanic, your source material, informed gameplay or story decisions. So for instance, you will remember that you need to at one point enter the fourth smokestack of the Titanic to retrieve the notebook, and then there's a confrontation and the iceberg hits. We thought this is probably in the game because the Titanic had this fourth unused smokestack, which was simply decorative. That's an interesting detail about that ship. And we speculated that it was interesting enough for you to basically use it as a stage to lead the player to. But if you look at the fact that Van Hardelitz is looking for a hiding place for its notebook from a rational point of view, he could hardly do worse than putting it at the top of that smokestack.
Exactly. Well, gameplay sometimes is not logical in the real world. That's exactly why we put it there, because that was the dummy smokestack. So perhaps it wasn't rational, but it aided in terms of gameplay and made it more adventurous and fun.
Obviously, time plays a big role in the game. There's an in-game clock and there's a time limit, as you already described. And as players, we were pretty confused for quite a while as to how time works in the game, because the pocket watch is ticking, the seconds hand is moving, and thus it looks as if time passes. But in the first section of the game, it actually doesn't. Time jumps forward at key moments in the story. And then once the iceberg has hit, the game switches to sort of real time. Then time is actually running. However, during conversations, time skips ahead by, I think, 3 minutes or something like that, no matter how long the conversation actually takes. So all of that felt a bit haphazard, as if it wasn't really meant to end up this way. And we speculated whether Titanic was originally conceived as a game that was running entirely in real time.
That's a very astute perception. We were thinking about making it completely a timed element that you had, and I forgot what we had originally said, 6 hours or something to do everything. But we quickly realized that wasn't going to be enough, that people would dawdle. People wanted multiple sessions of play. But we wanted to really create the suspense of having to get off the boat, having to be a race against time. So what we came up with was the idea of unlimited gameplay in the first act. And by assembling the various items and finding them, you trigger the second act, which is then the countdown in real time, 2.5 hours. That was the compromise. And, I had not remembered the solution with the dialogue when you were basically talking that took 3 minutes. I hadn't thought about that until today for a long time. But yes, that was the decision.
Let's talk about story decisions. Because one interesting thing about the game is that it has a framing story. It doesn't start on the ship, it starts in World War II. And then we're traveling back to the Titanic, so it has a sort of a time travel component. And we wondered, why is that in the game?
Well, what we wanted to do, we were playing with the concept of time, playing with the idea that your fate can be decided by decisions made a long time ago, the so-called butterfly effect. And so we wanted to create a feeling of melancholy in a sense that you were entering and you were finding out this character that you had been assigned had had a failed life. So the idea that he was in arrears with his rent, that he was a failure and had only memories of another more successful time was important. The idea of returning you borrowed heavily from that old Hollywood saw, The Knock on the Head, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz or anybody going back in time, Vertigo. You went back, so you had a chance to relive your life. So the question remains, is this, to borrow a more modern analogy like the Black Mirror, just the moments before your actual death? You're wondering what could have been. Or could you really go back? I think it was important, and I think it gave you, again, some of the outcomes, and I don't want to reveal them. I don't know how many people still play it.
All of our listeners have heard all of the outcomes.
Oh, they have. Okay. So you could prevent World War II. In a sense, you could have prevented your own death if you had gone back and relived that. So I think it sets up a sense of melancholy right from the beginning, sort of a lost time for the player. And then the game becomes one of redemption.
But you're purposefully leaving it up to interpretation of whether that is actually time travel, or is it the last thoughts of a dying person, or is it an alternate dimension or whatnot?
I'd love to think it's whatever you would like to think, Christian.
Okay. That leads me to another topic, actually, because the story occasionally brushes the supernatural. There's this one key character, Trask, that spiritual medium, and he's portrayed as someone who may know more than he lets on. Or he's just a very good bluffer. And then there's Riviera, the French card shark, who has a boat pass that turns out to be the tarot card for death. And within the game world, nobody questions that. They just accept that that's a boat pass. But we as the players obviously wonder, what does that mean? Is there a supernatural element?
Well, there was a psychic allegedly on the Titanic, and a lot of the characters that you see are composites and based on some of the real characters that were on the Titanic themselves. And the aristocratic woman, the gossipy woman, talks about actual real people who were on the Titanic and what they were really up to. So kind of like Rose's mother in the movie. She's a gossip and she wants to get to know all these fabulous people. But as you may be aware, there was a lot of talk of the occult and superstitions and astrology that was extant at the time in Amero-European, in that world. So Trask was that kind of character. He was fun to imagine. I think, again, we were not deliberately talking anything about the occult, but we thought for mood and atmosphere, why not make that card life or death? Because that's what it was actually on that ship.
So there's no deeper meaning to that?
No, there's no deeper meaning to that at all. And we'll get back to the supernatural part of it. I still get notes and messages from people who would play the game and remember just how scared they felt playing it late at night, wandering down those hallways. It was very much like the Stanley Kubrick movie, The Shining. I think a lot of that has to do with the music that Scott wrote, which was, to me, so amazing in establishing that mood.
The atmosphere on the board of the ship is one of the strong points of the game, most definitely. But one thing that we particularly loved is the cast. I think the cast of characters is definitely one of the strongest points of the game, both in their personalities and their voices and also their depictions. And we loved the encounter with these characters and the interactions with them. Miss Pringle, for instance, I was kind of afraid of her because she's quite stern, but I also felt drawn back to her because it was just interesting conversations. And the same goes for a lot of the characters.
I think Penny Pringle would have been, if we had done a sequel, I think she should have been the star of the show. She was wonderful. I had a friend who was a British journalist who worked at the BBC and got one of her friends to record the dialogue strings in London, and we just emailed them to us. Of course, this was considered revolutionary at the time, right? But she just thought it was hilarious, with these Americans writing these sort of things. So I think I told her to play it as if she was an exasperated schoolmarm, that you needed to be shaped up in that great, very severe Scottish way, that strict sort of Calvinist upbringing that they have in Scotland, like a cold shower, as it were. So yeah, you sort of felt bad if you came and you had failed.
Yeah, indeed.
She was great.
So tell us about how all of the characters were made. I guess you would have had to shoot footage of them and then kind of stitch it together to the animations that we see in the game. Very interesting style, very interesting aesthetics, I think. But how were they made?
We had a costumer and we cast the characters for their looks and their facial expressions. So what would happen is that we would have a digital camera that would capture them looking surprised, looking sad, smiling, happy. We had a whole, at least 50 expressions that they would do along with vowels and consonants, so that you had all of these facial expressions and reactions. And those could all be keyed in to the recorded voices. So literally the animator, once they had sort of 60 versions of Penny Pringle, they could key in both reactions and lip movements to the sound. So that's how they would animate, by the sound waves. Again, this was Bill's genius to create a system that allowed for that.
And the voice actors were not identical with the actors.
They were dubbed. Right. The voice actors were not. We took somebody who was an actress in the States to play Penny Pringle visually, and then we used a voice character from the UK, from London, and paired them together.
So if I get you correctly, the actors were not actually actors in that sense. They were more like photo models. They were doing these still poses.
We're all actors, though, because actors are very good at creating facial expressions. Right. There were a few non-actors among them, but we quickly realized that actors were great because they would get it on the first take, look surprised. They had the right amount of exaggeration that you needed that still made it look, it was exaggerated, but still natural. And that was real good fun.
And it is a fantastic result. I really like the style of the game.
It was funny that it worked so well. We were still experimenting. We had tried it with Dust because Dust is similar, but I think we were able to perfect that with Titanic. The lighting was more sophisticated on the actors, the shading, and our animators got very good at creating and being able to animate these characters in their dialogue. It was sort of crowdsourced in the sense that the animators became the directors, so they would look and listen to the dialogue and then match the expressions.
Were there any cameos from the dev team?
Well, I think at the end, when you see all the dead bodies floating by, those were some of the Cyberflixers. Well, I have to tell you that Buick Riviera, the model for Buick, was Rand Cabus, who was our marketing guy. Rand was very dashing with that kind of Van Dyke beard. And we had so much fun creating Buick Riviera in Dust that we had to bring him back, because we soon realized that that was within his historical lifetime. He could have been on the ship. So we brought Buick Riviera back to life. He was supposed to have a very bad French accent. And of course, your automobile aficionados will know what a Buick Riviera is. I don't know. Did you understand that was a popular American car?
No, actually, that was lost on me.
A Buick Riviera was very much one of those cars with tail fins from the 1960s. Americans would have picked that up.
Unfortunately, I missed that. But now I know. Thank you so much.
No worries. But it's always fun to put things like that in there. But it was great. It was good fun to create those things.
Were you tempted to play a character as well?
No, I didn't have time and I wrote it. So, I was in there, so to speak. It was all of me. So that was okay. I just completely enjoyed playing it. And once it was all done, it's very hard when you've created something to approach it again completely neutral in your reaction to it, because of course you had so much emotion in it. Again, it was one of those things that is so wonderful when these things happen in creative work, where the people working on it, the zeitgeist as it were, the technology, all of it seems to come together for that moment. And that to me is what Titanic was. It sort of crystallized that moment in the mid-90s when anything was possible in computer gaming and independent small companies could command a hit without spending millions and millions of dollars as it costs today.
Since you wrote the game, I'm sure you can clear up a mystery for us because there's the Georgia storyline in the game. So Georgia is a driving factor, and her storyline culminates in us rescuing her at the end because she's been poisoned. And then we can also save her by getting her onto one of the lifeboats. So we have invested a lot of energy into that, and we've even saved her in the end. But then you already mentioned there are multiple endings, but none of them features her. And we wondered why.
It's interesting because I think what we were trying to do at that point was, and it's obvious, I think, that you and Georgia might have had a relationship, but I think at that point we wanted to give precedence to historical outcomes. And it was kind of more interesting to leave that up in the air. If it turned out to be a happy ending, did you guys ever get together?
Yeah, I can understand that reasoning, but I have to say that from a player's perspective, it is kind of disappointing because she's, in a sense, a love interest. There could be a positive outcome of this entire adventure where our protagonist and Georgia end up together again, but that is not a resolution that we are granted by the game.
Yes. And perhaps looking back on it, and even had we responded to consumer research, maybe we should have. But, there could always be a sequel.
Right. Well, actually, could there? Because the good ending, doesn't it show us actually living happily ever after? Well, I'm not entirely sure. I think it shows us retiring.
Right. But I think the idea is, again, what's so wonderful about the Titanic as a historic fact is that it touches on so many things that are human that human beings will always come back to it and build creative works of art around it. So, yeah, there could be a completely different interpretation. I mean, I've often wondered what this game would look like now, given the advancement in technology, the idea of multiple players. Perhaps it would come a day where people would come aboard the Titanic and everybody gets to play a role. And then, of course, it's how you interact with everybody else that determines the outcome. It's not preordained. That could be kind of interesting as well.
Indeed. My co-host Gunnar and I, we've played through the game thoroughly. We played through it several times until we were reasonably certain that we had seen and understood everything. And yet, at the end, when we reflected upon the name of the game, we were still uncertain what the adventure out of time part actually means. Maybe you can help us understand.
That name, Adventure Out of Time, can be translated in English in two different ways. You're familiar with the phrase, I am out of time.
Yes.
This is an adventure out of time, meaning, of course, that there is a time element to it. The second meaning, adventure out of time, is alluding to this idea of time travel and the idea of going back into the past.
Can you describe the success of the game?
Oh, well, it was, I want to say a top 5, definitely top 10 seller for Macintosh. PC, it was a great seller. Now, of course, a lot of this had to do with not only that it was critically well received, it also came out at the same time as the Paramount movie, James Cameron's Titanic, with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. Paramount had decided not to do a game since ours was already on the market, or it was going to be on the market before theirs. That was a happy coincidence. It was just well received, a big seller.
And also over here in Germany, because actually, why did we play this game? Because typically we are choosing games which are relatively obscure. But in this case, this was a game which was suggested to us by our listeners. And once we picked that up and did our series on Titanic Adventure Out of Time, we started to realize how many people actually had played this game. And many of them as kids with their parents, often also with their mothers. And that is pretty unusual, in particular for the audience which is listening to our podcasts.
Yes. Well, I think, again, you could maybe bring it all back to my sister-in-law who said I wanted a game that I could play in 2.5 hours before I have to make my kids dinner. Or, of course, coming home from work. But I think the Titanic as a symbol appeals to adults and children for different reasons. Children are struck by how could something this big founder and sink so quickly. And I think adults are always connected to the sense of loss. What would I have done? It's compelling to all ages, the Titanic.
And the game was also localized for Europe, if I'm not mistaken. Were you involved with that? Was Cyberflix involved with that in any way?
We're involved with some of our marketing department, and we have another producer work helping localize the French edition. There was a Japanese and the German edition. And of course, the German edition, we quickly ran into problems with, considering the anti-Nazification laws that Germany has, which we had no idea about.
Right. The game features Adolf Hitler.
Correct. And so we didn't really understand what that meant, but we did have to change some of the script because of it. And I'm not quite sure what the German law says. I don't really recall, but two of the things that you can take are watercolors by the anonymous Viennese artist, who of course turns out to be Adolf Hitler, who was painting in Austria at the time. So that was conceivable, but the conceit there was that if you leave with these paintings, they become famous. Hitler becomes famous. His art becomes much in demand. So he has no reason to pursue the path to power that he did in Germany in the 1920s. One of the things that we didn't realize was that the German market had some strict policies about talking about Nazis and Adolf Hitler. Is the law still on the books in Germany? Is that still the case?
Yes, it's still the case, but the interpretation has changed. Back when Titanic came out, games were treated differently than other cultural media, for instance, movies, in that you couldn't, for instance, show swastikas in games, even in a historical context. I mean, it's still unlawful to use this kind of symbols out of context and, of course, to glorify the Third Reich and the regime. However, if it's done in a historical context, also in video games, these days it's tolerated.
Okay. Yeah. So again, that was an example of the culture not catching up with the technology, because people were always looking at computer games or video games back then as they weren't really an art form. And it's great to see that a game like the Titanic and all of the other great games like Jordan's and Myst are seen, I think, correctly as the precursor to a lot of things that would come after them.
Titanic made a lot of people happy. And I also think that for a lot of people, games like Titanic open the doors to the medium, to computer games in general.
And that was something we were aware of. We wanted to make games that appealed to everybody. We were very conscious of that because, again, we knew that we were creating what could possibly be considered a new art form, but one that needed to have an appeal beyond just young males, as it were, that everybody could enjoy it. And again, something that was a universal theme like Titanic had that sort of appeal.
So there are actually two things on the CD-ROM. There's the game itself, but then there's also this section called Tour, where you can go through the Titanic and then have the cast from the game as tour guides who are explaining historic details. And it seems as if originally some of these guides were downloadable content or extra purchases. So can you tell us a bit more about the rationale behind that part of the program and how it worked out?
We'd always had an educational component in mind for the Titanic. And this was done after gameplay, and it originally existed online. And again, you have to remember, this was one of the first times anybody had ever done this. The idea was that we'd be providing something extra for educators and for people who were actually interested in the historic aspects of the ship, that they'd want to go and spend some time, but not necessarily take away from gameplay. We didn't want to put them in the game because we felt that anybody who was there to play the game didn't really want to sit around and be talked to about the historical aspects of the Titanic when they could do it outside of that. That's how that was done. And I think in retrospect, looking at that, we could have done that even more. But again, time and money, was that going to be an ultimate payoff for gamers? Probably not. For everybody else, I think in the back of our minds, we all hoped that teachers would assign their kids to go buy the game to learn about the Titanic. I don't think that was anything that actually happened. I did hear from people who really enjoyed that aspect of it. Surprisingly enough, a lot of people did. Once you inhabit a space, whether something like this, you do become curious about it. You want to know more of the details. I mean, during the research, I was lucky enough to get a chance to meet with Walter Lord, who wrote a very famous book in the States and in Britain called A Night to Remember about the Titanic. And it was very interesting talking to him because his apartment, he had a huge apartment in one of the tonier addresses in New York. And it was filled with Titanic memorabilia, including actual items from the survivors. And I think that aspect of it is one of those things that just intrigue people, and it intrigued me. And I was lucky enough, after the game had come out, Discovery Channel had done an expedition to the site of where the Titanic sank. So for 2 weeks, I was there with the French team, and they were bringing up items from the wreckage fields. And to actually hold a silver plate that had been in first class that had just been brought to the surface was pretty thrilling for me.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then I remember they brought up a valise, a leather suitcase that was perfectly preserved. The tannins had been preserved. And then they opened it on the deck, and everybody just took one step back because inside of it were clothes perfectly folded and packed that never made it to New York. But the person who had owned this suitcase had packed these clothes and, of course, had probably died. They were men's clothes. So, as a matter of fact, they found that there were initials on the suitcase, and they traced it to somebody who did not survive. But the human tragedy at that moment really comes to the fore, where you really realize these were living, breathing human beings like ourselves that were put in a terrible situation. And most of them lost their lives. Most of them drowned. Yeah, that was quite moving. But again, I think once the Titanic gets a hold of you, it's hard to let go. I've moved on. Life has moved on. And to this day, I still meet people who will tell me, I so enjoyed playing that game as a kid, or I love that game. So that makes me very happy to hear. That's very rewarding. And again, it wasn't just me or Bill or Scott, but there were so many people who worked so hard on that and were so talented.
And I think you all can be proud of what you accomplished.
Well, thank you. I think we are. I think for everybody who worked on that, it was something that we all took such great pride in. I remember that time fondly.
So that concludes my questions. Maybe to tie this with a bow, I think with the next Cyberflix game, Red Check, you were no longer involved. Is that correct?
I was not. I had left the company and gone to San Francisco and ended up working for Britannica.com, which was the Encyclopedia Britannica's educational online arm.
Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. This was very insightful. I learned a lot of new things, and I'm very sure our listeners will appreciate it. Gut, das war das englische Gespräch mit Andrew Nelson und hier kommt jetzt meine deutsche Zusammenfassung. Der Andrew Nelson ist der Autor des Spiels Titanic Adventure Out of Time. Er war außerdem auch Producer und von ihm stammt auch die Idee zum Spiel. Also eine zentrale Figur. Andrew Nelson ist ausgebildeter Journalist. Er hat Journalismus studiert an der University of Missouri School of Journalism und nach der Zeit bei Cyberflix hat er dann auch lange als Reisejournalist gearbeitet für National Geographic. Aber in den frühen 90ern, also nach seiner Unizeit, da ist er in den US-Bundesstaat Tennessee gezogen, nach Knoxville, um dort für ein Startup als Redakteur zu arbeiten. Andrew Nelson sagt, Tennessee ist überwiegend bekannt für Countrymusik und für Whisky, nicht unbedingt als Technologiestandort, aber in dem Städtchen Oak Ridge, das ist quasi ein Vorort, sag ich mal, von Knoxville, da lag eine der wichtigsten Produktionsstätten, das Manhattan Project, das US-Atomwaffenforschungsprogramms in den 40er Jahren. Und in Knoxville liegt die University of Tennessee und zusammen bedeutet das, es gibt hier eine Tradition und auch eine Basis für technologische Innovation. Und aus diesem Oak Ridge kommt ein technisch sehr versierter junger Mann namens Bill Appleton. Der hat zunächst in den 80ern ein paar Jahre lang in Kalifornien bei Silicon Beach Software gearbeitet, auch schon an Spielen für den Apple Macintosh. Vor allem aber schreibt er dort die Entwicklungsumgebung Supercard. Das ist eine fortschrittlichere Alternative zu Hypercard. Das kennen Stay Forever-Hörer möglicherweise diesen Namen. Damit ist zum Beispiel Myst programmiert worden. Also der hat in den ausgehenden 80ern schon einen gewissen Szene-Room auf dem Mac, der gilt als ein bisschen ein technologisches Wunderkind, und dann ist er zurückgezogen nach Knoxville aus Heimweh und hat dort gemeinsam mit einem Freund, mit Jamie Wicks, der Computergrafiker ist, eine Firma gegründet. Die hieß anfangs Cybersoft, aber wurde dann kurz darauf umbenannt in Cyberflix. Deren erstes Spiel war ein 3D-Shooter für den Macintosh namens Lunicus, und zu dieser Zeit, als dieses Lunicus entstand, da stießen weitere Leute zu Cyberflix dazu und einer davon war auch Andrew Nelson. Also der gehört mit nicht unbedingt zum Gründungsduo, aber zu dieser Urmannschaft von Cyberflix. Für das zweite Spiel von Cyberflix, das heißt Jump Raven, schrieb er dann schon die Story. Und das beides, Lunicus und Jump Raven, das sind noch sehr Macintosh-spezifische Titel, aber die sind dort überraschend erfolgreich. Das Jump Raven ist im Jahr 1993 sogar ein ziemlicher Bestseller auf der Plattform. Vor allem aber steigt zu der Zeit Paramount ein und finanziert die junge Firma mit mehreren Millionen $. Dieses Startup Cyberflix, das hat dann also inzwischen 2 Stockwerke in einem Loft am Market Square bezogen, mitten in Downtown von Knoxville, in einem Gebäude, wo ansonsten Banken und Geschäftsleute residieren. Und der Andrew Nelson erzählt, dass es einmal einen Feueralarm gab und dann hätten sich die ganzen Banker gewundert, warum da lauter junge Leute in Doc Martens mit den Armen voller Festplatten aus dem Haus rennen. Aber das war nun mal das Wertvollste an der Firma, also mussten sie das zuerst retten. Jeder hat sich die Festplatten geschnappt und raus damit. Und Cyberflix sei damals legendär für seine Partys gewesen. Das waren ja nun mal alles junge Leute mit dem Geld von Paramount. Und wie Andrew Nelson so schön sagte, ein Teil dieses Geldes sei in Teambuilding-Aktivitäten geflossen. Aktivitäten wie die Wynona-Rider-mit-Reißzähnen Party. Da war zwar nicht Wynona Rider da, aber ihr Bild zierte die Einladungskarte und laut Andrew Nelson sei das eine der legendären Partys von Ost-Tennessee gewesen damals, an die sich die Leute noch heute erinnern. Naja, jedenfalls waren alle bei Cyberflix so Anfangs 20er und die ganzen Programmierer und Grafiker, die stammten alle von der örtlichen Uni. Die bringen dann ihre Freunde mit und die Freunde werden dann auch angeheuert und so weiter. Andrew Nelson erinnert sich gern an die Zeit und das merkte man auch in dem Gespräch. Das war wohl eine ganz nette Atmosphäre da in der Firma. Nach Lunicus und Jump Raven kommt als drittes Spiel Dust, A Tale from the Wild West. Das ist der Abschied vom Action-Genre. Jetzt geht's hin zum Adventure und der Grund dafür war Myst. Das kam ja 1993 raus und die Leute von Cyberflix haben natürlich den Erfolg gesehen. Vor allem, dass es neue Zielgruppen erschließt, dass es schafft, so einen Weltenbau zu betreiben, dass es rausstrahlt über die Nerd-Zielgruppe, dass sich auch Frauen auf einmal für so ein Spiel interessieren und so weiter. Und Cyberflix, die sind natürlich Mac-Entwickler, ne? Auch wenn ihre früheren Spiele auch schon für den PC rausgekommen sind. Also es waren keine reine Mac-Titel, aber Lead-Plattform ist der Macintosh, genau wie bei Myst auch. Und das Myst basiert ja auf Hypercard. Und wie gesagt, Bill Appleton ist der Schöpfer von Supercard. Also es drängt sich nahezu auf, dass die Firma sagt, ach komm, sowas machen wir auch. Und die Jungs fanden Myst natürlich auch alle toll, aber ein bisschen esoterisch und ein bisschen kühl. Sie sagten, wenn sie sowas Ähnliches auch machen, dann machen wir ein bisschen was Lebendigeres und Zugänglicheres, vielleicht in einem Western. Das ist ein etabliertes Genre und das wurde es dann auch für dieses Spiel Dust. Und sie wollten mithilfe von Bill Appletons Technologie nicht nur diese Slides für die Landschaften machen, diese Cards sozusagen, auf dem das Hypercard und Supercard basiert, sondern, wenn man so möchte, auch Slides für die Charaktere, für die Personen im Spiel. Aber dazu erzähle ich nachher noch mehr. Also dieses Dust, A Tale from the Wild West ist ein erster Versuch in dem neuen Genre, aber das ist noch nicht der große Wurf. Das kommt dann mit dem nächsten Spiel. Und da startet die Entwicklung jetzt. Wir sind jetzt im Jahr 1995. Und natürlich ist das nächste Spiel, an dem sie arbeiten, dann Titanic Adventure Out of Time. Woher stammt die Idee zu dem Spiel? Der Andrew Nelson hat damals seine Schwägerin besucht in New York City. Die hat 2 kleine Kinder und die sprachen dann unter anderem auch über Myst, denn die Schwägerin hatte das Spiel auch mal gesehen und fand das super interessant. Aber die erzählte dem Andrew Nelson, mit 2 kleinen Kindern hast du einfach keine Zeit, Stunde um Stunde in so einem Spiel zu verbringen. Wenn es nur irgendwas gäbe, was eine tolle Geschichte erzählt, aber was nach 2 Stunden vorbei ist, so wie ein Film halt. Und der Nelson setzt sich ins Flugzeug und fliegt zurück nach Knoxville und da liest er zufällig einen Artikel über die Titanic und darin wird auch erwähnt, wie viel Zeit zwischen der Kollision mit dem Eisberg und dem Untergang des Schiffs lag, nämlich etwa 2,5 Stunden. Und Andrew Nelson denkt sich so, Das war, wie er erzählt, eigentlich der Geburtsmoment dieser Idee, ein Spiel um die Titanic zu machen, aber die Titanic hat auch noch 2 weitere Vorteile. Die CD, die ist ja damals ein neues Medium mit enormem Speicherplatz, aber es ist da schon klar, so ein Spiel wie Myst oder wie das frisst wiederum CDs zum Frühstück. Das sind grafiklastige Spiele, da bringt's dann doch nicht so viel drauf. Also braucht man idealerweise eine Spielwelt, die irgendwie logische Grenzen hat, wie zum Beispiel ein Schiff. Und die Titanic ist Mitte der 90er langsam auf dem Weg in die öffentliche Aufmerksamkeit. Der Nelson nennt das Zeitgeist. 1995, da ist James Cameron gerade mit einer Tauchcrew beim Wrack der Titanic, um Aufnahmen für seinen Film zu schießen. Laut Andrew Nelson wusste damals Cyberflix nichts davon, dass da an einem großen Film gearbeitet wird. Aber auch links und rechts davon häufen sich so ein bisschen Mitte der 90er die medialen Erwähnungen des Schiffs, wie zum Beispiel in dem Artikel, den der Nelson gelesen hat. Da führen also mehrere Dinge zusammen, die für ein Spiel über die Titanic sprechen. Aber wie gesagt, ein Ausgangspunkt in den Überlegungen von Andrew Nelson ist dieser Zeitfaktor, also die Tatsache, dass die Titanic nur begrenzte Zeit hat, bis sie untergeht. Wir hatten ja spekuliert, ob das Spiel nicht vielleicht ursprünglich mal als Echtzeitspiel geplant war. Und tatsächlich so war es auch, sagt Andrew Nelson. Das sollte ursprünglich ein durchgehendes Zeitlimit haben. Er weiß zwar nicht mehr wie viel, er schätzt 6 Stunden oder sowas. Aber sie haben es dann kassiert, als sich herausstellte, dass die Spieler, wie Nelson so schön sagt, gern trödeln, beziehungsweise dass sie das halt nicht mochten, unter so einen Zeitdruck gesetzt zu werden. Und deswegen gab es dann diese Twitter-Lösung, man hat unbegrenzte Zeit im ersten Akt bis zur Kollision mit dem Eisberg und danach gibt es dann das Zeitlimit. Also Andrew Nelson schreibt die Story und die Charaktere, aber er ist nicht der Spieldesigner im klassischen Sinn. Er entwirft zum Beispiel nicht die Rätsel im Spiel. Das ist nominell die Aufgabe von Bill Appleton, aber Andrew Nelson beschreibt es letztendlich als Teamwork. Da hat eigentlich das ganze Team zusammengelegt und jeder hat Ideen dazu beigetragen. Aber die Story stammt, wie gesagt, von ihm und damit also auch diese Rahmenhandlung, die ja nicht auf der Titanic startet, sondern im Zweiten Weltkrieg. Und er sagt, der Sinn dieser Einrahmung sei zweierlei gewesen. Erstens wollte er eine Art von Schmetterlingseffekt unterbringen, also den Gedanken, dass Entscheidungen aus der Vergangenheit Auswirkungen auf die Gegenwart haben. Und zweitens sollte der Start im letzten Moment eines gescheiterten Lebens sozusagen den Ton für das Spiel setzen, nämlich Melancholie. Und das spiegelt sich laut Andrew Nelson auch in der Musik des Spiels wieder, die ja auch eher getragen und ein bisschen melancholisch ist und die er übrigens ganz großartig findet. Die stammt vom Cyberflix Hausmusiker Scott Scheinbaum, auch einer der ersten Angestellten der Firma noch aus den Lunicus-Tagen. Jedenfalls bleibt laut Andrew Nelson absichtlich offen, ob die Reise zur Titanic real ist, ob das eine Art Zeitsprung ist oder ob das nur die letzten Gedanken des sterbenden Protagonisten sind. Das konnte oder wollte er auch nicht auflösen. Auch die übernatürlichen Elemente im Spiel leiten sich eher aus dem Szenario ab, also aus dem Zeitgeist des Jahres 1912, wo Okkultes und Esoterisches gesellschaftlich en vogue waren. Natürlich war an Bord der echten Titanic auch ein bekannter Spiritist, William T. Stead, und entsprechend gibt's im Spiel mit Leyland Trask ebenfalls einen Spiritisten. Das ist also auch wieder eines von diesen Elementen, die im Endeffekt sich aus der realen Titanic entlehnen, der realen Geschichte. Und da steckt laut Andrew Nelson auch keine tiefere Bedeutung drin. Noch nicht mal in der Tarotkarte, über die wir ja auch spekuliert hatten, die im Spiel als Bootspass dient. Nelson erinnert sich, dass sie da die Tarotkarte Tod benutzt haben, weil ihnen das metaphorisch passend schien. Denn der Zugang zu den Rettungsbooten entschied ja tatsächlich über Leben und Tod. Man gibt also quasi die Todeskarte ab und überlebt dadurch. Aber das war's auch schon, ja, mehr steckt da nicht drin. Titanic Adventure Out of Time hat ja diesen interessanten Look mit dem Mix aus 3D gerenderten Hintergründen und realen Personen, die aus vielen Einzelbildern animiert sind. Das Cyberflix-Team kannte offenbar die Multimedia-Künstlerin Laurie Anderson, die Freundin und spätere Ehefrau von Lou Reed. Und die Leute bei Cyberflix waren angetan von dem Motto von Laurie Anderson, nämlich virtuelle Realität wird sich erst dann real anfühlen, wenn sie schmutzig ist. Und für Cyberflix bedeutete das, virtuelle Welten zu machen, die nicht so steril wirken wie die von Myst, sondern irgendwie lebendiger. Andrew Nelson erzählt, wie sich Bill Appleton eine Nacht um die Ohren geschlagen hat, um für ihr Westernspiel Dust eine Programmroutine einzubauen, die Hühner auf der Straße rumlaufen lässt. Und zwar aus dem Grund, ne, das ist nicht notwendig, aber das macht die Spielwelt ein bisschen chaotischer und ein bisschen belebter. Und diese Programmroutine ist übrigens die gleiche, die in Titanic dann Menschen in der Spielgrafik rumlaufen lässt. Also wann immer jemand übers Schiff spaziert, was ja selten genug passiert, dann ist das den Hühnern aus Dust zu verdanken. Aber das Augenfälligste sind natürlich die Charaktere im Spiel und deren eigenwillige Animationsweise. Ich hatte ja angenommen, dass Cyberflix Schauspieler gefilmt hat und dann Standbilder aus diesen Filmszenen extrahiert hat, aber so war das gar nicht. Das sind keine Filme, das sind alles Fotos. Cyberflix hatte eine Digitalkamera, Mitte der 90er ist das noch ein teures Gerät, und sie hatten einen Fotografen und einen Kostümbildner und einen Beleuchter angeheuert und natürlich einen Schwung Schauspieler, und von denen wurden dann Dutzende von Fotos gemacht mit verschiedenen Gesichtsausdrücken und den ganzen Mundstellungen für Vokale und Konsonanten. Der größte Teil der Personen im Spiel waren laut Andrew Nelson keine Laien, sondern schon erfahrene Schauspieler, die sie auch richtig gecastet haben. Und zwar einfach deshalb, weil Schauspieler eine geschulte Mimik mitbringen und vor allem die Gesichtsausdrücke so treffen, dass sie deutlich erkennbar sind, aber nicht in Grimassen abgleiten. Und parallel dazu wurden die Sprachaufnahmen gemacht, die stammen also nicht von den Schauspielern, sondern von erfahrenen Sprechern. Penny Pringle zum Beispiel, die Person, die man sieht im Spiel, das ist eine amerikanische Darstellerin, aber die Stimme stammt aus England. Der Andrew Nelson hatte eine Freundin, die als Journalistin für die BBC gearbeitet hat, und die wiederum hatte eine Bekannte, und diese Bekannte hat Penny Pringle eingesprochen, und die Aufnahmen wurden dann per E-Mail zurück in die USA nach Knoxville geschickt. Und diese beiden Dinge, die Sprachaufnahmen auf der einen Seite, also die Audiodateien, und den Satz Fotos von der Person, das bekamen dann die Animatoren. Und die nahmen die Soundaufnahme als Basis und bauten dann Bild für Bild die passende Animation dazu, aus den jeweiligen Einzelbildern. Und da ist also keine Automatik dahinter, sondern alle Lippenbewegungen und alle Reaktionen für die Dialoge im Spiel sind handgebaut. Cyberflix nannte diese Spielcharaktere Cyber Puppets und die Animatoren waren die Cyber Puppet Animators. Und die sind dann auch die heimlichen Stars des Spiels, denn da ist der größte Aufwand reingeflossen. Insgesamt arbeiteten für Titanic Adventure Out of Time 15 Animatoren an den ganzen Dialogen. Zum Vergleich, für die ganzen Renderhintergründe der Titanic, also für die Spielumgebung, waren nur 7 3D-Grafiker notwendig. Also nicht mal die Hälfte. Die Miss Pringle jedenfalls, die scheint auch der Favorit von Andrew Nelson gewesen zu sein, denn er sagte, wenn es jemals eine Fortsetzung des Spiels gegeben hätte, dann hätte sie darin die Hauptrolle spielen sollen. Aber was ist mit der anderen wichtigen Frau des Spiels? Was ist mit Georgia? Die können wir ja am Ende des Spiels sowohl vor der Vergiftung bewahren, als auch vor dem Untergang retten, und dann kommt der Abspann und verliert überhaupt kein Wort mehr über sie. Wir fanden das sehr unbefriedigend. Und Andrew Nelson hat zunächst mal so quasi im Vorbeigehen bestätigt, dass unser Protagonist Frank Carson und Georgia früher mal was miteinander hatten. Das ist ja ganz offensichtlich, sagt er. Wir fanden das nicht unbedingt so offensichtlich. Aber dafür war er sich ehrlicherweise nicht mehr sicher, warum Georgia im Abspann nicht thematisiert wird. Er vermutet, dass das absichtlich offen gelassen wurde, ob Carson und Georgia wieder zusammenfinden, vielleicht auch im Hinblick auf eine potenzielle Fortsetzung. Aber stichhaltiger scheint mir eine andere Sache, die er angebracht hat, nämlich er sagte, sie hätten irgendwann entschieden, seiner Erinnerung nach, dass sich die Enden nur mit historischen Verläufen, mit den historischen Entwicklungen beschäftigen und nicht mit den persönlichen Dingen. Und tatsächlich, da taucht ja überhaupt nichts Persönliches auf, da kommt ja überhaupt keiner der Charaktere nochmal vor. Da wird ja nichts davon weitergeführt. Mit der Ausnahme von dem Schicksal des Babys, aber das ist auch noch falsch zugeordnet, was auch eher ein Fingerzeig dafür ist, dass das vielleicht ganz hätte entfernt werden sollen, ja, dass das ein Fehler ist, dass das drin ist, dass sie wirklich alle persönlichen Dinge da rausgenommen haben. Aber das wusste er nicht mehr genau. Die Entwicklung von Titanic Adventure Out of Time startete nicht unbedingt mit dem Anspruch, das Schiff so authentisch wie möglich nachzubauen. Das kam im Laufe der Zeit und durch die Beschäftigung mit dem Thema. Das ist ein bisschen wie bei The Last Express, wo wir sowas Ähnliches ja auch schon hatten von Jordan Mechner. Andrew Nelson erzählte, dass die ganzen Grafiker bei Cyberflix anfangs auch nicht sonderlich begeistert davon waren, sich jetzt mit Details des Einrichtungsstils des Jahres 1912 herumschlagen zu müssen. Aber dann haben sie sich da so reingefuchst und am Ende konnten sie kompetent über Tapetenmuster und Möbelstile fachsimpeln. Und laut Nelson war dem Team aber bewusst, dass sie hier mit ihren Mitteln durchaus was Bedeutsames leisten können. Dass das auch das erste Mal war, dass jemand versuchte, die Titanic digital in diesem Detailgrad nachzubauen. Das Spiel enthält ja nicht das ganze Schiff, sondern de facto nur einen Bruchteil davon. Absichtlich natürlich, weil das hätte, wie Nelson auch sagt, ansonsten Zeit und Budget völlig gesprengt. Das Team hat sich die Orte rausgesucht vom Schiff, die interessant waren für die Handlung und für den Zusammenhang des Schiffs. Deshalb gibt's solche Sachen wie den Squash Court und das türkische Bad und das Fitnessstudio, weil das halt ungewöhnliche Orte sind. Deshalb ist auch die Brücke im Spiel, obwohl man da ja am Endeffekt gar nichts machen kann, aber das ist einfach ein faszinierender Teil der Titanic und deswegen haben sie das auch eingebaut. Und deshalb klettert man auch in diesen 4. Schornstein hoch im Laufe des Spiels. Ja, sagt Andrew Nelson, das ergibt keinen Sinn, dass Van Hadelitz das Notizbuch da oben im Schornstein versteckt, aber Titanic Adventure Out of Time sei immer noch ein Abenteuerspiel und ein gutes Abenteuer führt eben auch an abenteuerliche Schauplätze. Laut Nelson seien Historiker und Titanic-Kenner ganz angetan gewesen von der Möglichkeit, sich durch das Spiel, also mit dem Spiel über die Titanic zu bewegen und dadurch eine sehr plastische Vorstellung von der Räumlichkeit und der Größe des Schiffs zu bekommen. Und das habe sogar geholfen, historische Fragen zu beantworten. Nelson nannte als Beispiel die Frage, warum waren eigentlich die Rettungsboote nicht alle voll? Das sind ja teilweise Rettungsboote von der Titanic abgelegt, die nur zu einem Viertel oder ein Drittel oder sowas besetzt waren. Warum haben sie die nicht voll gemacht? Er sagt, wenn man sich im Spiel über das Bootsdeck bewegt, dann würde einem klar, dass die Titanic so groß ist, dass durch die Tiefe des Raums und die Deckaufbauten gar nicht unbedingt sichtbar ist, wo noch Rettungsboote leer sind, also wo noch Platz ist, zumal wenn man sich noch eine panische Menschenmenge dazu denkt. Ich habe ehrlich gesagt überhaupt keine Ahnung, ob das eine haltbare Theorie ist oder nicht, aber so hatte Nelson das erzählt. Jedenfalls, das Spiel war für Cyberflix ein enormer Erfolg. Es kam 1997 ja kurz vor dem Film raus und bekam dann durch den Film Titanic einen enormen Boost, auch weil es kein Konkurrenzspiel gab. Paramount hatte sich laut Nelson dagegen entschieden, ein eigenes Spiel zum Film zu machen. Und Nelson weiß jetzt keine Verkaufszahlen, aber erinnert sich nur daran, dass das ein sehr großer Erfolg war, das Spiel. Das Spiel habe es in die Top 10 oder Top 5 in den Charts geschafft, sagt er. Ich habe hier die englische Version des Spiels, also die in England rausgekommen ist, nicht die amerikanische. Und da prangt auf dem Cover ein Aufkleber mit der Aufschrift meistverkauftes Titanic-Spiel. Okay, das will jetzt noch nicht viel heißen. Und Platz 2 in den US-Charts. Es könnte sein, dass sich das nur auf die Macintosh-Charts bezieht. Da lief das Spiel noch besser als auf dem PC. Aber ist auch wurscht, weil insgesamt war das einfach ein großer Erfolg. Also ein Millionenseller, auch international. Es gab lokalisierte Versionen für Frankreich, für Japan, für Deutschland. Laut Andrew Nelson mussten sie die deutsche Version anpassen, um die Verweise im Spiel auf Adolf Hitler und die Nazis rauszunehmen. Das konnte ich ehrlich gesagt jetzt nicht überprüfen. Falls jemand von euch zufällig die deutsche Version gespielt hat, dann schreibt uns gerne einen Kommentar, ob und inwiefern die sich vom US-Original unterscheidet. Neben dem eigentlichen Spiel gibt's ja noch diesen Tour-Modus und dazu erzählte Andrew Nelson, sie hätten da den Ansatz verfolgt, dass ihr Spiel auch als Lehrmittel eingesetzt werden könnte. Ist ja ein Macintosh-Spiel und Macs sind traditionell beliebte Schulcomputer in den USA, ist also nicht ganz so weit hergeholt. Die leise Hoffnung war wohl, dass die eine oder andere Schule das für den Unterricht anschafft oder dass Lehrer es ihren Schülern empfehlen, aber das schlug dann wohl am Ende nicht sonderlich durch. Und was bedeutet dann noch der Titelzusatz des Spiels, also Adventure Out of Time? Da haben wir auch ein bisschen drüber spekuliert. Und Nelson sagt relativ naheliegend, das sei einfach ein Wortspiel mit der Doppeldeutigkeit des Ausdrucks im Englischen Out of Time. Das kann sowohl heißen keine Zeit mehr oder auch außerhalb der Zeit. Das ist also eine doppelte Anspielung auf die Zeitreise und auf das Zeitlimit im Spiel. Naja, okay. Gut, Cyberflix nächstes und auch letztes großes Spiel war das Piraten-Action-Adventure Red Check. Da war Andrew Nelson aber schon nicht mehr beteiligt. Er verließ Cyberflix nach der Entwicklung von Titanic Adventure Out of Time und zog nach San Francisco, um dort für Britannica.com zu arbeiten. Das ist die Online-Ausgabe der Encyclopedia Britannica. Aber die Titanic hielt ihn noch eine Weile in ihrem Bann. Zu der Zeit kam ja dann der Film raus und am Eröffnungstag hat sich Nelson krank gemeldet, ist ins Kino gegangen und hat den Film 3-mal hintereinander angeschaut. Er war fasziniert davon, weil das ist ja jetzt für ihn die Vision eines anderen Interpreten auf den gleichen Stoff. Und zum anderen kannte er auch das Schiff in- und auswendig, also er wusste bei jeder Szene, wo die spielt. Und Ende der 90er hatte er dann nochmal die Chance, den Discovery Channel zu begleiten mit einer französischen Crew, die am Fundort der Titanic zum Wrack runtergetaucht ist und da Gegenstände geborgen hat. Und er hielt dann da damals einen Silberteller aus dem Restaurant in der Hand und das Team barg einen gut erhaltenen Lederkoffer und der wurde dann an Deck geöffnet und darin fanden sich perfekt gefaltete Männerkleidungsstücke von jemandem aus der 2. Klasse, der mit dem Schiff untergegangen war, der es nicht geschafft hatte. Und er sagt, in dem Moment war für ihn auch nochmal besonders greifbar die menschliche Dimension von diesem Unglück, das ganze Drama. Aber das Spiel an sich ist für ihn natürlich eine sehr gute Erinnerung, zumal er auch bis heute noch darauf angesprochen wird. Viele Menschen haben das gespielt, viele Menschen haben das auch jung gespielt und haben damit sehr positive Erfahrungen gemacht. Und das freut ihn natürlich und darauf ist er bis heute stolz und das kann er auch durchaus sein. Das war die Zusammenfassung des Gesprächs mit Andrew Nelson und damit schließen wir das Kapitel Titanic Adventure Out of Time jetzt aber wirklich ab. Freuen uns natürlich trotzdem noch über eure Gedanken und Kommentare dazu und hören uns dann bei der nächsten Stay Forever Spielstaffel oder beim nächsten Interview oder bei der nächsten Podcast-Folge wieder. Bis dahin.